So hello, everybody. I am Lilya Kaganovsky. I'm a professor at UCLA in the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures. And on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you today to the lecture by Professor Yulia Alekseyeva titled Everyday Anti-Fascism, Radical Media in the 1960s. This program is part of the Natalie Limonick program on Jewish civilization in memory of Miriam, Nissell, Rose. We hope that you can join us at many more Levy Center events this coming spring, and you can find more information on these upcoming events at the registration table near the entrance of the room. And I want to thank the Levy Center staff for making the arrangements for today's event possible. And I also want to take a minute to remind you all to please silence your phones. Thank you. So Dr. Yulia Alekseyeva is a multimodal scholar of media, film, and culture, specializing in the interactions between global media and radical leftist politics. She's currently assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and core faculty member of the Cinema and Media Studies program. Dr. Alekseyeva received her PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University in 2017 with a secondary specialization in film and visual studies. And prior to her appointment at Penn, she was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies. Her work is fundamentally comparative and transnational and delves into the film, comics, television, and digital media of Japan, France, and the former USSR. She recently completed her first academic monograph, tentatively titled Anti-Fascism and the Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in the 1960s. Dr. Alekseyeva is also a graphic artist specializing in nonfiction graphic narratives, comics journalism, and memoir. Her first full-length graphic novel, Soviet Daughter, which I highly, highly recommend to you all, was published by Microcosm in January of 2017 and won the VLA Diversity Award. Since then, she has published shorter nonfiction graphic essays in both peer-reviewed journals and book anthologies, and in popular outlets such as the Nib and Jewish Currents, where she also guest edited the Soviet issue in winter-spring of 2022. Her work truly bridges the public and the academic, and she has co-led workshops on theories of anti-fascism and abolition, grassroots comics creation, and political art making. In her talk this afternoon, Dr. Alekseyeva will focus on experimental documentaries from the 1960s, especially from France and Japan, through the overarching lens of anti-fascism. Central to the theoretical grounding of anti-fascism are two Marxist theoreticians who hail from different parts of the globe, but whose work and analysis of anti-fascist discourses are profoundly aligned. Japanese filmmaker Matsumoto Toshio and French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and French psychoanalyst Félix Guattari. As Dr. Alekseyeva argues, Matsumoto was the first theorist to explicitly describe avant-garde documentary as an anti-fascist form, and his writings elaborate most clearly on the necessity of this genre in the post-war moment, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, imperialist terror, and nuclear annihilation. Dr. Alekseyeva's talk will demonstrate how experimental documentary, stretching from the Soviet experiments of Dziga Vertov to the present moment, becomes a privileged art form that is uniquely capable of battling against a non-state and everyday fascist ideology, that is to say, against forces of conservatism and complacency. Please help me to welcome Dr. Yulia Alekseyeva.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful intro and for the invitation. And I am so thankful to be here and thankful for my friendship with Lilya and my friends and colleagues who are in the audience as well. So it's so great to see so many of you, many familiar and many unfamiliar faces. And I guess I'll just go ahead and get started, and hopefully we'll have time for conversation afterwards. So. In summer 2022, I attended a concert of the Ukrainian band Dacha in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Dacha, whose name means give and take in Ukrainian, describe themselves as an ethno-chaos band and are known for mixing Ukrainian folk songs with avant-gardist flair. interweaving a mechanical drone, the sound of animals produced by human mouths, unusual harmonies, and a frequently syncopated beat. Symbolizing the band's avant-folk aesthetics are the enormous black furry hats worn by all band members, reminiscent of the papaja hat worn in the Caucasus, but elongated so much that it appears more absurdist than traditional. I'd been a fan of Daha Braha since first seeing them in 2014 and look forward to the performance in Ardmore, which I knew would be full of much more solemnity and gravitas because of the Ukrainian war. Attendees gathered around the stage, many dressed in the traditional embroidered shirt called a vyshyvanka. Here's where the story gets more complicated. Behind the band members, a screen was erected, projecting a blend of animated and photographic visuals representing the trauma of war. Here, MC Escher-like birds slowly morphed into warplanes. A grotesque collage appeared with photographs of shelled and bombed-out buildings in Ukraine, strewn with blood and corpses. Then an animated film loop in a naive, almost twee, children's storybook style showed a hip young, light-skinned couple holding their children in a folkloric house, which grew roots and stretched into the ground and seemed to protect the family from rockets overhead. And that's what you see in this image. Perhaps most horrifying were the abstracted women with flower crowns flowing with ribbons on both sides, a common symbol of Ukrainian nationhood, hovering on the screen like ghosts, their bodies patterned in white lace. The women had shields instead of faces, and on these shields were crosses, specifically reminiscent of the cross of St. George, the crusader and warrior saint used in many ultranationalist political parties in present-day Europe. Even more crosses hovered in the air above the shield women. Confusion and then horror set in. I was born in Kiev and emigrated to the US in childhood with the second wave of Jewish refugees from the USSR, now leaving a newly independent country embroiled in political chaos and swift economic collapse. Seeing the animated visuals behind my favorite band, I realized with growing horror that my ethnicity, euphemistically titled the Pятый punkt or fifth point on the Soviet identification card, on which Jew was unceremoniously written, continued even in the 21st century to render me a perpetual other. I could never be one of them. To be Ukrainian did not mean to live and breathe in a region, but to share a bloodline rooted in the soil. There was more, for in that moment of shock, momentarily I forgot my own complicity in this endeavor. I attended the concert as a longtime fan, and like many, I assumed Daha Braha's art to be anti-fascist. I brought 8 friends with me, not knowing the show would devolve into a dangerous ethno-nationalism masquerading as left politics. I did not stop the screening. I did not grab my loved ones by the hand and walk out. I did not stage a protest. I stood petrified, unable to reconcile the contradictions in aesthetics and politics that I witnessed on stage. And I did not expect to confront these concerns at a concert of an experimental folk band on the outskirts of Philadelphia. As the odd blood and soil rhetoric of this avant-folk concert demonstrated, the media of a state battling imperialism is not de facto anti-fascist in nature, nor is artistic experimentation anti-fascist in itself. What then are the principles of anti-fascism? How can we as activists craft artworks that align with anti-fascist principles? And what does it mean to view fascism as interwoven with everyday activities of work or art making or leisure, with our behavior, our relationships, and the behavior of others? At the Daha Braha concert, I could feel myself being powerfully swayed by the visuals. I even noticed several strangers wipe away tears, just as a deeper, far more traumatized part of my psyche rang distant alarm bells. As media scholars, we are trained to notice when techniques of editing and cinematography affect our mental states. Why use a jump cut or superimposition or an unbearably long tracking shot if not to affect the way we think, feel, and perceive the world? Daha Braha's show concluded with the audience forming a circle to sing the Ukrainian national anthem. I noticed several off-duty cops sporting Blue Lives Matter t-shirts and hung back. Whatever anti-fascist media was, this was not it. I do not intend to use this anecdote to criticize Daha Braha, a band I still admire greatly. Russia continues to be an imperialist and criminal aggressor. According to a recent article by Al Jazeera, since February 2022, 6.5 million Ukrainian citizens are now living outside the country as refugees, and an estimated 3.7 million are still displaced within Ukraine. 14 million, or nearly one-third of Ukraine's population, fled their homes at some point during the war. To date, over 10,500 civilians have died and almost 20,000 have been wounded. I use this anecdote of the avant-folk concert to highlight a sticking point in our understanding of political aesthetics and the way fascist rhetoric and behavior can appear on all sides of the conflict, including and importantly within left liberal spaces. Geopolitics is not separated from the sphere of the personal, and art is not immune from fascist narratives despite aligning with the proper ideological position. Nor are leftist ideologies inherent to a more modernist style. At first, I was fascinated by the band's decision to use the animated documentary medium for political purpose, especially a style so unusual, so painterly, and so whimsical in nature. Yet experimentation does not in itself make anti-fascism. Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, for instance, might use dramatically canted angles and constructivist framing reminiscent of Soviet Jewish director Dziga Vertov's 1929 Man with the Movie Camera, but the comparison ends there. As Andrew Hewitt argues, leftist movements do not lay claim to the aesthetics of the modern, as exemplified by Italian futurist and proto-fascist F.T. Marinetti. Unfortunately, fascism is not stasis, standardization, and regimentation, despite claims to the contrary, of similarly suited brainwashed goose-stepping men and women. The sad fact is that fascism can be profoundly interesting, even pleasurable or countercultural. Georges Bataille, for instance, viewed fascism as a concentration of heterogeneous elements that provoke intense affective reactions. One cannot then derive an artwork's fascist or anti-fascist qualities on aesthetics alone, nor, as we have seen, can we derive it from explicitly militant intent. Bataille argues that although socialism is integral to countering what he calls the revolution of fascism, invoking Enlightenment-derived rational positivism is not effective. The only true opposition to fascism is not a rejection of affect in favor of alleged unbiased objectivity, but instead must come through the mobilization of unproductive and heterogeneous irrational forces, what he calls violence, excess, delirium, madness, breaking the laws of social homogeneity. Anti-fascism must not attempt to tie up the mysterious and the poetic, the unknown and the unseen neatly into a rational and scientific bow. In the field of documentary, a medium so frequently and perhaps singularly complicit in the upholding of fascistic power relations, anti-fascist work should not strive to inoculate the viewer with the ideology of truth with a capital T, but should aim to unveil, estrange, and re-enchant. It should inspire and empower the viewer to perform the analytical work themselves. As I will demonstrate, this idea was shared among many communist documentary filmmakers of the 1960s. This talk seeks to address how an artwork, especially a documentary, can be anti-fascist through an interweaving of anti-fascist form and anti-fascist content. The bulk of this talk derives from the introduction and conclusion of my recently completed book, Anti-Fascism and the Avant-Garde, Radical Documentary in the 1960s. My book answers the question, what is anti-fascist documentary, by arguing that the project of anti-fascist media must entail a critical and questioning lens, a challenging of knowledge production and the status quo via what film theorists Annette Michelson and Diane Rodowick term epistemological struggle. Experimental filmmaking and editing techniques are usually essential to induce this rupture of consciousness, one that joins difficulty and sometimes violent discomfort, what Japanese theorist and filmmaker Matsumoto Toshio calls the sado-masochistic aesthetic, as we will see, with affects of liveliness, play, and even pleasure. The goal of this struggle is personal and political emancipation through a revitalization of perception, both an estrangement and a surrealist reenchantment that makes life, in Svetlana Boym's words, lively and worth living. This project traces its argument to anti-fascist documentary theorists and filmmakers in France and Japan during the 1960s. It charts a trajectory of interrelated movements that respond to their specific historical and national context, yet are fiercely and consciously intertwined in transnational debates around Marxist political aesthetics. For the purposes of this talk, I will focus on two, or rather three, Marxist theoreticians who likely never met, but whose work and analysis of anti-fascist discourses are profoundly aligned. The post-structuralist pairing of psychoanalyst Félix Guattari and philosopher Gilles Deleuze, alongside Japanese filmmaker theorist Matsumoto Toshio, best known for the 1969 quasi-documentary Funeral Parade of Roses. First, a word on my use of the term fascism. My use of fascism is closely tied to Deleuze and Guattari's expansive notion of the term. Their study of fascism in relation to what they term schizoanalysis, as opposed to psychoanalysis, in their 1972 Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, might, as Michel Foucault postulates, be alternately titled An Introduction to a Non-Fascist Life. In his preface to Anti-Oedipus, he writes that Deleuze and Guattari's concept of fascism is not only historical fascism, the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini, but also the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates us and exploits us. The fascism in my project likewise expands beyond a fascism witnessed in actually existing ultra-right-wing parties, although it certainly and necessarily includes them. It thinks of anti-fascism in the Deleuzean framework as an ethics, and I follow Jack Bradich in this understanding of Deleuze's concept of microfascism, which finds fascism in microspheres of everyday life as well as the usual social and political venues, and aims to understand fascism's emergent dimensions, the subtle dynamics in play before historical expressions manifest. As Deleuze and Guattari write, this is just an image of the book, of Jack Bradich's book, which I highly recommend. Only microfascism provides an answer to the global question. Why does desire desire its own repression? How can it desire its own repression? The masses certainly do not passively submit to power, nor do they want to be repressed in a kind of masochistic hysteria, nor are they tricked by an ideological lure. Desire is never separable from complex assemblages that necessarily tie into molecular levels, from microformations already shaping postures, attitudes, perceptions, expectations, semiotic systems, etc. Desire is never an undifferentiated instinctual energy, but itself results from a highly developed engineered setup, rich in interactions, a whole supple segmentarity that processes molecular energies and potentially gives desire a fascist determination. Leftist organizations will not be the last to secrete microfascisms. It's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not even see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective. Later on in this talk, I will go more in depth into this concept of the fascist inside you, which gained popularity in the wake of the 1968 revolts in France. It is not for nothing that Deleuze and Guattari argue that leftist organizations will not be the last to secrete microfascisms. Microfascisms are complex and difficult, and no one, importantly, is immune to their microformations, which already shape postures, attitudes, perceptions, expectations, etc. As I will demonstrate, Matsumoto Toshio's contemporaneous understanding of our complicity with fascism and the concept of everyday fascisms and anti-fascisms is remarkably similar. I compare Matsumoto and Deleuze-Guattari's notions of fascism and anti-fascism not to argue for a direct lineage of influence, but to demonstrate how the figures emerged out of a similar philosophical and aesthetic milieu. An integration of the psychological into the political is common to both, as well as a deep investment in the power of aesthetic form to incite radical personal transformation. Matsumoto, for example, intended to pursue a career in psychology at the prestigious University of Tokyo before secretly abandoning those plans and joining the Department of French Literature. His work continued to think through the psychological in relation to film, frequently responding to the work of Freud. Another obvious commonality is the use of Oedipus as a structural framework. Although Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari did not publish Anti-Oedipus until 1972, it is truly a fascinating coincidence that Matsumoto's Funeral Parade of Roses likewise mobilizes the Oedipus story. The film is a reimagining of the Oedipus myth in the queer subculture of 1969 Tokyo, in which Oedipus becomes Eddie, a trans gay boy in the parlance of the film, who unknowingly sleeps with her father. James Phillips explicitly analyzes the film through Deleuze as an oppositional strategy for the disabling of Oedipus, although one could argue that its take on the Oedipus myth is not as much of a critique of Oedipus as its queering, its dehabituation and disorientation in the vein of Sarah Ahmed. Yet it is not a coincidence that both Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus and Funeral Parade of Roses respond to the global insurrections of 1968 by presenting a critique or queer reworking of Oedipus Rex. Perhaps both represented what Julianne Borg describes as the antinomian spirit of 1968, with antinomian referring to the rejection of laws and norms in the name of a liberated ethos. Borg writes, was normalcy tantamount to normalization? Was psychiatry merely the furthest reach of an array of social and political institutions whose intention, or at least effective function, was to quiet all kinds of rebellion? Was it not society itself that was mad? End quote. Such thinking approximated Matsumoto's fundamentally surrealist interest in unveiling what he called the unreality of the quotidian, in which the everyday and capitalist imperialism held any number of seemingly invisible fascist aggressions. Matsumoto believed the avant-garde documentary was the ideal mode of anti-fascist filmmaking in its unique ability to express both internal and external worlds. His mobilization of documentary, whether through his neo-documentaries of the early 1960s, such as Song of the Stone or Weavers of Nishijin, or the highly experimental Funeral Parade, aligned with the rejection of laws and norms that Borg describes as integral to the 1960s spirit. For Matsumoto, documentaries must, paradoxically, reject truth claims and embrace the hand of the artist. Matsumoto and Deleuze Guattari all aligned a rejection of a single incontrovertible truth with the work of anti-fascism itself. One is reminded again of Annette Michelson and her concept of epistemological struggle, which she draws from Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov. Michelson argues that through the use of a range of cinematographic and editing tricks that persistently remind us of the film's crafted and creative image, Vertov questions the most immediately powerful and sacred aspect of cinematic experience, disrupting systematically the process of identification and participation, generating at each moment of the film's experience a crisis of belief. It is not an accident that Matsumoto's film experiments, as I outline in a forthcoming article in the journal Film History, are quintessentially Vertovian in their explicit use of experimental technique such as fast-forward, freeze-frame, stop-motion animation, animated intertitles, superimposition, or split-screen. What's more, Matsumoto even describes these techniques as methods of everyday anti-fascism, as ways to forcefully, and he would say sadistically and masochistically, destabilize our conceptions of truth and fantasy. Amy Poncher recently argued that Matsumoto's keen interest in phenomenology aligned with his artistic practice. She writes that Matsumoto was intent on using the creative and experimental capacities of the moving image to continuously push both the filmmaker and the audience's sense of perception away from solidified structures of knowing and acting in society, end quote. Matsumoto's experiments are as destructive as they are liberatory. Jonathan Hall similarly argues that Matsumoto aimed for film to produce an optic corporeality, a force upon the body that corroborates fantasy and the real within the body of the spectator. Its potential force is striking and able to destabilize our conceptions of truth and fantasy. Experimental documentary is essential for this rupture. In Consciousness of the Aesthetic Sadomasochist, or On the Internal Process of Creation and Its Artistic Utility, and Matsumoto is constantly using these giant, very verbose titles. This is very much a Matsumoto thing. An article published in Kiroku Eiga, or Documentary Film, in February 1960, and which I'm currently translating for the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Matsumoto criticizes educational documentary by noting that the artist must not be a teacher, merely inoculating the viewer with truth. I won't read the entirety of this quote here in the interest of time, but I want to emphasize Matsumoto's critique of documentary films for being either educational or instructional, and for taking their cues from Enlightenment-era positivism. He also criticizes them for being regressive, for continuing to fetishize the previous century's tailbones. Instead, these regressive and reactionary qualities of contemporary documentary must be denied by an artistic propaganda, which strikes within oneself, is knocked back, and transforms itself as well as others spontaneously. These are all quotes from this article. This is what Matsumoto means when he describes an aesthetic sadomasochism in the article's title. It is a leftist autocritique which marries political ideology to self-analysis. For Matsumoto, neither fetish nor education in filmmaking can suit what he terms the current revolutionary era of the 20th century and its political catastrophe, undoubtedly referring to the Asia-Pacific War. Investigations of the wartime past were extremely common at the specific time of Matsumoto's writing. Protests had started to ramp up against the controversial US-Japan Security Treaty, known as ANPO, which allowed the United States to maintain military bases on Japanese soil. As the Cold War progressed, the US attempted to strategically use the unique geographic position of Japan to keep communism at bay. The United States leadership reinstated former war criminals into positions of power. One of these war criminals, Kishi Nobusuke, eventually became prime minister. In a somewhat recent and perhaps not entirely unsurprising turn towards right-wing policies, Abe Shinzo, the longest-serving prime minister in Japanese history, was the grandson of this former Class A war criminal. Just a few months after the publication of Matsumoto's article, on June 15, 1960, Japan would see, as Nick Kapoor writes, the climax of what were, by almost any measure, the largest and longest series of popular protests in Japan's history. For a period of 15 months, from March 1959 through June 1960, an estimated 30 million people from across the archipelago, approximately one-third of Japan's population of 92.5 million, participated in protest activities. Matsumoto was writing near the climax of a highly politicized era, one in which everyday citizens who still remembered the trauma of war saw collaboration with the warmongering Americans as a potential return to a fascist past. It's interesting, there are quite a few resonances with West Germany here, I think. Although Article 9 of the 1945 Japanese Constitution, drafted at the behest of the United States, prevented Japan from participating in military endeavors, Japanese leftists knew that although Japan held a global image as a peaceful nation in the wake of the catastrophe in the Second World War, its reality exposed nothing of the sort. The context of Matsumoto's writing, then, is a criticism of an alleged claim to knowledge when confronted with political hypocrisy and the terror of potential imperial remilitarization. For Matsumoto, film needed to confront, quote, the consciousness of those who had to face the execution of criminal war leaders with complicated feelings, and the consciousness of those who are trying to reflect on their own experiences, end quote. In this article, Matsumoto notes that the Prime Minister Kishinobusuke, quote, was a war criminal fascist and continues to be a war criminal fascist, and that the Japanese monopoly capital and its government are now being newly imperialist, end quote. There is thus a particular need to address wartime experiences and war responsibility in the contemporary moment. For Matsumoto, in order for documentary to overcome its roots in an outdated positivism, it must include elements of the irrational. It must become an artistic propaganda. So these are all quotes from him. It's hard to kind of go back and forth between quote unquote. Assume that if something sounds weird, it's by Matsumoto Toshio. It must become an artistic propaganda that internally generates the destructive effects of everyday consciousness beyond the category of recognition. Here is where sado-masochism comes in. Film must sadistically reveal the irrationality of the external world and penetrate deep with the scalpel of criticism, while masochistically dismantling the artist's consciousness. This, importantly, is nothing less than a daily conversion. Without it, the distance from here to war propaganda movies is not far. What Matsumoto calls aesthetic sadomasochism, then, is nothing less than anti-fascism as a daily practice. Matsumoto's concept of autocritique, of looking inwards to transform the external world, has much in common with the project of surrealism, what Donald Lacrosse describes following Michael Lowy as a romantic anti-capitalism, an independent revolutionary Hegelo-Marxist dialectics barbed with strikingly original libertarian impulses, which underscores the internal necessity of binding internal revolts of consciousness to outbursts of insurgent collective action, end quote. Like Deleuze and Guattari, Matsumoto's Marxism aimed to cleave individual and internal revolt to the project of revolution. In fact, it is revolt's prerequisite. Individual creativity is key for the project of revolution. In a June 1958 article from the introductory issue of Kiroku Eiga, Matsumoto explicitly ties imperialism and fascism to the suppression of creativity witnessed by generic PR or public relations films. So I'm just going to read the entirety of this quote because it's really good. But PR films were very, 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 very common at this point in Japanese history in the late 1950s, and they were kind of the standard documentary fare at this time. We can say that the outside world is that which suppresses my artistic creativity and seeks to dismantle me through the murderous mechanism of making vulgar PR films, labor intensification and low wages, exploitation and oppression, the resurrected sound of military boots, the rapid resurgence of monopoly capital dreaming of imperial independence, Okinawa, Tunisia, the dangers of Wall Street, and the atomic and hydrogen bomb wars, the emasculated and fetishized many. A true avant-garde fights uncompromisingly with the sick part. The energy of the masses is like a dormant volcano. It is interlocked with the self-aware organization centered on the proletariat class. It is a history of struggle, revolution, the progress of the peace movement on an international scale, the struggle for freedom and independence, and the conviction of human liberation. The inner world is my anger, sorrow, suffering, joy, etc., toward the outer world. It is an ideology and a passion that seeks to achieve the emancipation of the self and the transformation of the external world by engaging itself to the avant-garde of history. When I say that I perceive and express reality as subjectively, I must perceive both the outside and the interior holistically. This is emblematic of the Marxist Japanese post-war documentary sensibility. Matsumoto ties self and world emancipation, noting that both are necessary for the struggle of liberation. He argues that an artist must be an avant-gardist who fights uncompromisingly with the sick part of society, in contrast to the emasculated and fetishized many. Elsewhere in Kiroku Eiga, Matsumoto criticizes the fetishization of the masses. For the most part, Matsumoto writes, the masses have absolutely no self. They are closely tied to dogmatism, blindly enforcing the policies of authoritarian leaders. And, as we have just seen, sees documentary filmmakers as fetishizing tailbones. Yet Matsumoto's distrust of the masses should not be read as a pro-capitalist sentiment of the individual against the collective. For Matsumoto, the masses do not exist as a uniform organizational body. Each citizen must perform an internal transformation that is then carried out into the external world through revolutionary acts. Matsumoto privileges the avant-garde documentary as the only anti-fascist documentary style of the post-war period, the only one that responds accurately to current historical conditions. As he believed, it is the sole form of film that aids the transformation of consciousness and the emancipation of the self. It is not mere form, but an ideology and a passion that fights uncompromisingly with militarization and proto-fascism. It is a mode of filmmaking that is as effective and sensorial as it is critical. The filmmakers I discuss in my project, who vary from Agnes Varda to Chris Marker, Hani Susumu, Imamura Shohei, and Jean-Luc Godard, amongst others, all see the anti-fascist avant-garde documentary as a critical mode of activation and enlivening. This emphasis on life contrasts with what Bradish describes as a death-style fascism, what Deleuze and Guattari describe on capitalism and following Nietzsche as the ascetic ideal, the cultural extract, judging life, belittling life. Everything labors for death, everything wishes for death, end quote. In these last few minutes, I want to bring attention to the contemporary landscape and the relevance of these various theorists to the present day. It is my belief that the lessons of the films and debates featured in this project connect crucially to a contemporary moment in two ways. One, in their emphasis on media literacy, and two, in their connection to the project of abolition. First, the concern for media literacy is not new. Social science disciplines have especially embraced the notion that the media we consume needs to be decoded or assessed and thoughtfully and consciously created. 1960s communist experimental documentary filmmakers questioned images as a transparent link to indexical reality. There are parallels, in fact, to the AI-generated images of today and the inability to separate truthful images from their deep-fake versions. Soon, no amount of close analysis will be able to tell the image from its simulacrum. Another approach is needed, as the 60s theorists anticipated, far before their time. Yet their models were far more radical and liberation-minded than the models of today, and more interwoven with debates in philosophy and cultural studies. This concern with media literacy is crucially connected to the way we perceive and interpret the world. We imagine that our access to truth and moral rectitude allows us to viciously critique and cancel others, but we so rarely point the critique inwards towards ourselves. This is a carceral framework, and it is this that connects media literacy crucially to the project of abolition. It is not an accident that the oft-repeated phrase, "kill the cop inside of your head," originated with the protests of May 1968. The phrase "chassez le flic de votre tête," or technically "get the cop out of your head," appeared on the cover of the January 1969 short-lived journal Action, and became associated with an anti-authoritative leftism. This phrase aligns the abolition of the carceral state directly with anti-fascism, and is linked to Deleuze and Guattari's anti-Oedipus. As Deleuze and Guattari argue, repressing desire not only for others but in oneself, being the cop for others and for oneself, that is what arouses, and it is not ideology, it is economy, end quote. For Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism arouses a desire for control of others and of oneself, what they call asceticism. Modern life is defined by this warped, internalized carcerality. Crucial to my argument is the tie between the technique of film form and the ability to radically affect and its ability to radically affect the way we perceive reality. In an interview from 1962, Agnes Varda claimed that film can condition us. It can liberate and reframe what restrains our thinking and feeling. But the stakes of this argument also exceed the confines of film or even media at large. At heart, this argument is also about the process by which we can counter fascism in our ways of acting, thinking, and feeling, and in the way we treat others. It is fundamentally connected to liberation psychology, to a liberation achieved not just through military superiority, but in the words of Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman, through understanding the psychological maiming that affects all involved in oppressive practices. Liberation must involve insight, restoration, and an opening for greater humanity for victims as well as perpetrators, bystanders, and witnesses. Fittingly, they describe liberation as psychological jailbreak, necessary for the creation of a new commons. This project did not emerge out of quiet thought and reflection. It is integrally bound to the messy, conflict-ridden work of political organizing. The seeds were sown in my 6 months working an official role in conflict resolution at the Democratic Socialists of America. My project was finished while on sabbatical here in LA and means tested in a workshop I co-led titled Rethinking Fascism at the Silver Lake Independent Jewish Community Center in March 23, 2023. Participants who were mostly but not all Jewish and mostly but not all self-declared leftists learned and investigated the concept of microfascism. One participant, entirely unprompted, admitted that the idea of microfascism made them worried and uncomfortable, not because they didn't think it was correct, but because they acknowledged the many times in their own lives when they engaged in behaviors that could conceivably be called microfascist. A drive for the punishment of others, a fear of acknowledging one's own complicity, a mindset of perpetual victimhood that might excuse one's own reactive or problematic behavior, a rigidity of thought, a judgmental or domineering higher-than-thou attitude convinced of its own understanding of truth and reality. To which I responded, sitting with this uneasy feeling, this discomfort, and reckoning with it is in fact the point. The battle against fascism is a battle that must be fought daily and perpetually in the human mind. When asked to brainstorm methodologies to counter such viewpoints, participants independently arrived at similar conclusions to the filmmakers and theorists I analyze in my project: play, curiosity, combating rigidity and perfectionism, and the acceptance of ambiguity and contradiction. Importantly, there was no end to this work. It was meant to be a permanent revolution of the self, a perpetual unbecoming. As one group brainstormed in a drawing on butcher paper, you can see this on the lower right side of the screen, the cops in our heads can transform with curiosity into unique and colorful individuals, but then habit and complacency return the heads invariably back to cops. And the cycle continues. You can't really see it, but there are like two arrows. There's cycling in them. This project is meant to aid the self-transformations inherent in this perpetual cycle. The idea began with Deleuze and Matsumoto, but in my organizing work, I was also greatly inspired by Adrienne Maree Brown's work on emergent strategies. When I was reminded that Jack Bradish's analysis of microfascism controversially claims, following Deleuze, that it can erupt even in leftist movements. It is pervasive and latent, embedding itself in our relationships and our subjectivities, end quote. Brown likewise describes behavior witnessed in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests, a form of other-focused punishment suffused with carcerality. Instead of attacking the state, leftists attacked one another. Brown writes, "The tools of swift and predatory justice feel good to use, familiar, groove in the hand easily from repeated use and training, briefly satisfying, but these tools are often blunt and senseless. Why does it feel like we are committed to punishment and enjoying it? Why do our movements more and more often feel like we are moving with sharp teeth against ourselves, and what is at stake because of that pattern, that feeling? Not only are we trained to be our own policemen, but this feeling of carcerality can even feel good. It can groove in the hand easily from repeated use and training, can become a broken record, more enjoyable and more familiar with each use." Deleuze and Guattari describe this behavior in 1,000 Plateaus. Instead of the great paranoid fear, we are trapped in 1,000 little monomanias, self-evident truths and clarities that gush forth from every black hole and no longer form a system, but only rumble and buzz, blinding lights giving any and everybody the mission of self-appointed judge, dispenser of justice, policeman, neighborhood SS man. How then to do the work of abolition and anti-fascism when everyone and anyone, leftist or right-wing, can become the cop and neighborhood SS man? As Chris Marker's voiceover exclaims at the end of his 1962 documentary Le Joli Mai, an ending which centers on a Parisian prison, no one is free until we are all free. And we are all indeed far less free than we might think. Common among Brown, Deleuze and Guattari, and Matsumoto, Watkins, and Schulman, and the many theorists in this project, is an attempt to recognize that the vast majority of people cannot be slotted into the simple categories of victim, bystander, and abuser. We are all usually some combination of the three. The work of anti-fascism is the work of untangling one's own complicity, of recognizing ambiguity, and of engaging in the vulnerable work of reckoning and autocritique. Such work recognizes the inseparability of the political and the personal. It understands that liberation must be felt internally before and alongside its manifestation externally. To estrange the familiar, to shift perspective, becomes a radical act. Everyday anti-fascism entails an ontological and epistemological struggle that can be both painful and pleasurable, a different form of enjoyment from the briefly satisfying familiarity described by Brown. It is a feeling resolutely unfamiliar, its path unknown and unknowable. It is a process of surrender, of desubjectification, of a shedding of old skins, but it is a path that brings, in Dziga Vertov's words, the viewer back to life, their cinematic sensation, or what he called kino shishenya. What for Matsumoto are unknown and unseeable things, or in Japanese miyanai-mono, must be brought to the surface. The connection, likewise, to surrealism, myth, poetry, and madness is key, for, as Bataille argues, fascism is not rational. It will not be defeated by reason and argumentation. Bataille claims that anti-fascism must stoke a passion for democracy and a delight in its disorders, in the words of Robin Marasco. It is meaningful also that contemporary critics like Sylvia Federici and Jackie Wang, abolitionist poet and author of Carceral Capitalism, are engaged in a project of re-enchantment. Wang's work argues that the very ability to imagine different and better worlds is tied to dreaming, to communist affect, to Freud's oceanic feeling, and to radical acts of imagination. Radical art making can never replace the work of abolitionist organizing and anti-fascism in the streets, but it necessitates and requires it to create conditions of liberatory perception and what I call revolutionary phenomenology, and to make our own world livable in the first place. This is especially important today when Ariel Angel, editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents, writes, quote, "These days I feel the threat of fascism humming in my body like a once-spoken groan before the rain," end quote. It is a threat I feel too, and it is my belief that this communist, re-enchanting, fundamentally abolitionist project of everyday anti-fascism is essential to the project of imagining a new and better world. Thank you.
I assume Yulia would be happy to take questions from the audience, if you have some. Anybody like to begin? Please.
I'm a teacher, and this all plays out a lot right now in schools in terms of having a non-punitive and non-personal attitude, and we're in a place of great shifting, which is hard, and I'm wondering, is there media engagement for youth, where is that happening, and how are there things to have that discussion? Because it's like the real on the ground. It's very overwhelming. Like you try to have that conversation, like screaming "bitch" at the top of your lungs is not your word because you're a boy, and it means I can take advantage of a woman, and she can do nothing about it because she's nothing. And then everyone's just screaming "bitch" again, at you. It's so charged right now. And I think these ideas are really, really interesting and really useful, and they take time. And sometimes the reality of moment-to-moment life is that time doesn't exist. But I'm just curious, what kind of is there anybody studying that, how to engage with some of these ideas of young people in a way that might be meaningful to them through media?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I feel like there are certainly, I'm sure, many people in kind of more communication studies fields that are working on engaging with young people specifically. But I know in the classroom, in my kind of just what I try to do as an ethics is to, be less punitive myself with how I treat, my own students, and understanding that, if this is constantly coming up right now in departments that I work with in terms of AI. A lot of students are using AI to write their papers. It's really hard to police, and then this concept of policing students for doing that that's what comes to mind for me in terms of this kind of more system feeling of carcerality. But I know that many instructors are actually having open discussion with students, and one of my colleagues actually works with students together to create a code of conduct with them that doesn't necessarily say you can't use this ever. I don't know to what extent that works. It's one of those things that might work more in theory than in practice.
I'm asking more about media. I think it would be really interesting, and it would be an interesting maybe area of study that hasn't been done of how to, because you're looking at artists, and people are exploring ways for people to think these things and feel within their body and all of that stuff. And I think particularly for youth, which is this really going to matter, what's coming, in the new world. And I really for the first time felt this sense of a lot of the violence that I'm seeing is people are just trying to remake something. It's a really horrible form of rebirth that it's always cycled around. But I just think it would be an interesting area for people to look into. Is how can we connect on that kind of more artistic, less verbal level? Because I can do that, and I can do it with all the love in my heart. But there's something else that just a thought of maybe an area of study for people to do, or how to reach people.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Michael's got a question.
Hi. Hey. I have a question about the relationship between everyday fascism, as you're using it here, and what I'll call historical fascism, so sort of recognized fascist movements. And I asked that partly, I see here like the neighborhood SS man. I'm wondering like what's the relationship between what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about as the neighborhood SS man, which sounds metaphorical, I would say, in some sense, with like the actual neighborhood SS man. I asked that because I've been reading and thinking about and writing about a book called Bystander Society by Mary Fulbrook, which is the history of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and sort of looking at the way that everyday relations and ordinary people are brought into complicity and collaboration and provide and ultimately construct the conditions of possibility for genocide. And so, yeah, and I see there like these kinds of, I mean, I think she's not at all using anything like Deleuze and Guattari, but she is talking about these sort of micro events, as I was just calling them to myself in the last few days, which are contributing to this construction of a fascist society. So I don't know. I'm just curious how you were, how you would see this kind of approach to fascism lining up or not lining up with a sort of mass fascist society.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I definitely need to check out that book. I can kind of respond to that question in two ways. One, by talking about what Deleuze and Guattari would say about this, which is, that it's the difference between the molecular and the molar, and that, and microfascisms have to kind of combine, and that one is essential for the other. But then actually, I think the more interesting response would be to think about it literally, because at least in the Japanese context, there were literally neighborhood SS men, like not the SS, but during the Imperial War, there was the construction of what are called tanarigumi, which were neighborhood units. And these like micro neighborhood units would have a leader. That leader would then be responsible for getting ration cards, for telling the others what like the central administration was talking about. In theory, it's not terrible, right? It's like a neighborhood network, but these were in the service of spreading imperial propaganda. And Matsumoto explicitly calls these tanarigumi fascist neighborhood organizations. Like I could see that being straight from his words. The article I translate, it goes off on the terror of these micro-organizations that continue to be a part of Japanese society. They still exist, not to the same extent, but they certainly existed more than they do now in the 60s. So it was a continuation of the fascist past and continued to be a way to spread, even though on much less top-down, but still pretty top-down, like information from the central administration and the government. So I think actually there is a literal way in which, there is the neighborhood SS man, which is the, your friend who is mean to someone on the internet, but then there's also there were people that were the neighborhood watch, in a way. I think you could sort of connect it to various neighborhood watch organizations and things like that. So I think it actually is quite literal, and it seems to relate to what is happening in the 30s. So hopefully that answers your question. But I can go on to the Deleuze Guattari later, but yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm a graduate student here working on Japanese cinema, so my questions is more connected to Japan. The first one is about the periodization of this project or your book project, because we know there's the global 1960s and there's the term we know as the long Japanese 60s. So I'm wondering, was this 1960s you is referring to, or since you're working on a comparative project, how do you balance this temporal gap between the two terms? And the second one is personal curiosity. Many of your interpretation of the aggressive anti-fascism reminds me of the Foucault, which was in the 70s. So I'm wondering if you build any connection in your work, or is your project have anything to do with Foucault in general?
Yeah, thanks so much for your questions. I actually published an article on Foucault in connection to a lot of the filmmakers I discuss. It was in Art Margins in I think June or July of 2020. 2021. Anyway, so there is quite a bit of connection. So for those that don't know, Foucauldian is landscape theory, and it's the idea that the landscape has a potentially fascist dimension. This is especially, I think, the case in Japan, where the idea of like furusato, which means like homeland, your home space, home environment, is imbued with this kind of there is a very small element of like blood and soil rhetoric with regard to it, and it does have a very deep conservative dimension. So during the late 60s and early 70s, there was an attempt to criticize this focus on landscape by disrupting it in various ways. So the cover, the title card, like first slide of this talk, is actually a film that is very connected to Foucauldian, which is The Man Who Left His Will on Film by Oshima Nagisa from 1970. So I connect this film to and two other films to the idea of Foucauldian. And in this film, a documentary filmmaker. It's a fictional film, but it's about a documentary filmmaker who is making films about the protests in the anti-ANPO protests in 1970 rather than 1960, and he is making films that seem very abstract and are just showing empty landscapes, very kind of generic city streets, like a house with like a mailbox in front of it, or a highway. And in the process of filming, slowly the violence inherent in these structures is unveiled, and you see a rape happen in one of them. You see someone attack someone else, and in my article, I actually relate that to the critique of critique of landscape that I saw happening around the George Floyd protests, because I noticed, at least in Philadelphia, and I think this is also true in other places, that when buildings were tagged or set on fire or like broken into, there was a lot of kind of reaction from otherwise quite liberal people who would say, oh, but they shouldn't have attacked the buildings. The building didn't do anything. But then I think the Japanese theorists would argue that no, there is violence that is inherent in these institutions and these buildings. And these, at some point there were so many tan buildings around where I live that I started calling them tan buildings with a yoga studio on the ground floor. It's just like, I just made that up. But that there is this violent dimension in gentrification. And even though the Japanese context is different, I think there are ways of tying them. And my book is less about that. That's more this particular article, but just for lack of space. But I think there's a lot of connection there to what's happening today. And actually, I'm glad that you noted the kind of temporal gap, because what I want to do in my book is, and it's under review now, so fingers crossed, we'll see. But I kind of I use Japan as actually the center, and Paris is a little bit the periphery, as opposed to what it would be otherwise. And it's broken up into 5 years, a different chapter per year. It goes 1960, 1962, 1966, 1968, 1968, and goes between Japan and France to kind of see what was happening in each of those countries. And what you see is, I'm sure you know, that in Japan, the kind of proto-1968 protests were happening much earlier, right, in 1960. So by kind of centering Japan, it's sort of reworking the narrative and showing like actually the roots were sort of laid for this movement much earlier, and especially allows me to talk more about this idea of complicity, because I think that is where France and Japan and several other countries, but I think France and Japan are really aligned in the way they were the communist filmmakers in both countries attempted to prevent what had happened before. So yeah, thanks for your questions. Mm-hmm.
I might have a question for you. Mm-hmm. It's completely not formulated well in my head at all. But I'm really struck by I like the Daka Braka reading very, very much. First of all, and I want to return to it. But I'm struck by the formulation that fascism is not rational. Mm-hmm. And yet, to counter fascism, we're supposed to counter it with madness and surrealism. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to figure out how squares, right? Or the film is sadistically sever the unconscious, right? And somehow but if you go back to the Dziga Vertov images, both of them, but particularly the second one, really strikes me as something coming out of the unconscious.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can sort of unpack that. Like, so on the one hand, it is itself irrational, and yet we're supposed to counter it with the irrational in order to break through what?
Yeah. Has anyone tried to argue with like a irate uncle about the facts of politics?
Right.
Like would know that like
absolutely.
bringing up facts doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I think another way of like thinking about it is unless it's fun, people don't want to do it. You know, so if the contrast to a really effective in the sense of feeling and intense and some kind of maddening, and Daha Braha are a liberal band. They're not fascists. They're not. But they are using this imagery, I think, unconsciously that is presenting this narrative. Unless you make anti-fascism exciting and fun and I'm really interested in how leftist filmmakers can try to bring the bizarre and the actual fun and sexy part of leftist organizing and life to the surface, rather than the kind of strict, I guess a kind of contradistinction or contrast in my work is the kind of filmmakers I talk about in most of my work with Jean-Luc Godard's Dziga Vertov group, where there you have like a failure, where those films are, if anyone has ever seen them, they are so boring. I'm sorry, but they're just incredibly dull. I've now watched them enough times where I actually do feel a kind of pleasure in rewatching certain scenes, but they do the part of the epistemological struggle, like the part where they're trying to teach the media literacy, they're trying to teach you how to see, but they're not trying to teach you how to see in a way that makes you really excited to do that. So these films were disasters. They made like no money. Not that they did it for money, but there were screenings that were people like rushed out. They would cancel the screening, So it's just this mode of, well, if you have this strict, kind of socialist, but in a kind of strict Hegelo-Marxist sense, if the audience isn't having a good time, in the sense of if they're not excited by it, they don't, it doesn't have to be so kind of mindless in the way that it gets at your emotions the way that the Daha Braha does, and it shouldn't. But if you're not swayed emotionally by something, why would you do it? So
no, I get it. It's Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? It's
exactly.
It's the complete irrationality, and then trying to counter that with some kind of no, but the facts are, guess who won? Naomi,
Speaking of which, I was wondering how you position or deal with or relate to democracy in the project. Is it positioned as the antithesis of fascism or as an organizing principle that itself, I assume, secretes fascism? And also sort of to the point you were just talking about, I say this as somebody who's going to go stand in line in a magnet school to vote in a couple hours. Democracy is not very fun. Fascism is a lot more fun than democracy. I can tell from the movies. So how is it sort of dealing with the fascism, democracy, and the sort of experiential miasmas around the two, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one it's not necessarily one I look at directly in my work, like democracy, except to share that, and this isn't from the book, but just from my own reading of the archives, that the word democracy doesn't actually come up that often at all. In the Japanese context, it might be because the Liberal Democratic Party is the conservative party, so it's, whatever. It doesn't have the same kind of feeling that it does in the United States, but there is it's a kind of confounding question, because the New Left, and all of the filmmakers are kind of associated with the New Left, are kind of fundamentally more democratic because they're against the authoritarian kind of old left of communism. So within this like 1968 moment of the upsurging of this kind of revolt, this cultural and political revolt, there's, I think, an inherent understanding that these movements are more democratic than the kind of Soviet Communist Politburo way of doing communism in most of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But what I think is important in all of the films and filmmakers that I analyze is that they know that just doing the hard work of democracy isn't enough. I think a good case in point is Anya Zvarda's 1962 film Salut les Cubains, or Hello to the Cubans. And instead of a political treatise, and there are moments where she's talking about what happened during the revolution and the and Che Guevara and the histories of colonialism and imperialism in Cuba, most of the film is about art and dancing, and it's really fun. And I think what I love about these films is that they emphasize how interrelated the arts are to the work of democracy and organizing. You can't really, they have to be together, who was it that said, maybe attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, probably not Rosa Luxemburg, but there's no revolution without dancing or singing. Emma Goldman. I'm terrible Philly resident. Oh my God, yeah. Emma Goldman. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering about some different theories about documentary film. So I'm not terribly well versed in this, but I recall when I was learning about documentary film, and of course we used Bill Nichols'
Love him the best.
framing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was wondering about I believe it was the poetic documentary, and maybe just seeking to understand differences between how you might discuss poetic documentary and then this type of experimental film.
Yeah, that is such a funny and really good question, because this book has gone through maybe 7 drafts. It's honestly been such a beast, but in maybe the version, all are. Yeah, well, good. It's not just me. In the second or third version of it, I had just taught a documentary class, and I got really into Bill Nichols and I love categories. It's one of my fascist personality traits, that I need to atone for. But I got really into Bill Nichols and the different categories of poetic, expository, reflexive, participatory, performative, and observational. And I know I teach this all the time. I love these categories, and I was told by my reviewers, you need to leave these categories. They're holding you back. And I'm okay. But I think Bill Nichols would probably say that that the type of films that at least this project is working with, and in the earlier iteration I used these terms a lot and I just cut them out because they were just a little bit too, rigid and structured, is reflexive and poetic, and sometimes performative, because performative is when the kind of director enters into their film as a protagonist. So probably most people are most familiar with Michael Moore, but Anya Zvarda also did that quite a bit in his films. So her films, and Jesus Christ, but the reflexive aspect I think is the most crucial, and that's where I kind of draw it from Dziga Vertov and from Man with a Movie Camera, which is constantly showing how it's created, and especially the scene with Svilova where she's editing the films, and you're constantly brought out of the film and reminded that you're watching it, and that's something that contemporary documentaries almost never do, because it turns out that people don't like being reminded that they have to do some work when they're watching something. So in my classes, I'm constantly trying to hammer down, just force people to recognize that the HBO and Netflix style of documentary is not the only way of doing things, But then and I actually think that there's quite a bit of pleasure in the reflexive style that isn't something that is inculcated in most media today. So. Mm-hmm.
Two questions. First of all, what do you think of Ophal's documentaries, especially Saranukity and the sequel of it? And also the second one was the aesthetics of fascism, especially like, I've shown Riefenstahl's, I've had to sit through it several times, and there's absolutely no humor in it.
Which one? Sorry.
No humor, Riefenstahl's.
Oh God, yeah.
And the fact that they're just like so incredibly, like, in fact, I think Monty Python, everyone is used in almost their humorous on the opposite end. And I was just wondering what you thought about like that compared to like what Sontag said about like fascinating fascism, how it almost fits into like publicity or fashion photography.
Mm-hmm. It really does, yeah. God, it reminds me of how Triumph of the Will was used in the United States as a kind of comedy by just adding a hilarious soundtrack. Like you can keep the whole film, but you add like a Benny Hill, kind of soundtrack, and the film is totally different, with that soundtrack. And it was just screened like that in places in the U.S., which I think is really, really fascinating. So it's totally soulless, right? It's kind of boring. Like I watched Triumph of the Will for this project after refusing to watch it for of course, many, many, many years. And it is humorless. It's a humorless film. The seriousness with which they take these documentaries, and even though you didn't ask this particular question, Triumph of the Will is really interesting to me because what I didn't expect in watching the film for the first time, that first of all, 80% of the film is speeches. It's so boring. It's just, Nazis giving speeches. And then 20% is the shots that you're probably familiar with the goose-stepping Nazis and the hero shots of, beaming Aryans, But most of it is just speeches, and the speeches always emphasize, with very few exceptions, the victimhood of the German people. So I was thinking about that a lot in terms of not only is it humorless, but also this, we are victims, and that allows us, this is not stated in the film, but then perhaps this allows us to do all of these other horrible things. In terms of Ophuls, there were so many places where this project would go. Another version, I don't analyze Ophuls that much in the film, but in the book. But I think what connects more to Ophuls are what Japanese critics at that time would call semi-documentary, which included sometimes they were more allegorical, and I think this is maybe where Ophuls would come in a little bit more, where they're we would perceive them as fictional, but actually the documentary theorists would have, and many of the audience members would have claimed that was a documentary, not because they thought that it was actuality footage, but because the word documentary in the Japanese context is a lot more fluid. So Jules Dassin was considered a semi-documentary filmmaker in Japan. So I think there's another version of this project that looks specifically more at semi-documentary, more fictional films that have a lot of the same kind of interests, but because documentary specifically was perceived as so complicit in fascism, I wanted to focus more on documentaries. But, Yeah.
Hi, could you say a bit more about your community engaged project and how you turned that into theory? I know you touched on it, but I'd love to hear more about where did that idea come from? How did you set it up? What did it look like? And how does it impact your work now?
I'm going to piggyback. I'm going to throw that comment to someone sitting behind you, my collaborator on this project. But
Hi, I'm John. I went to the community workshop with Julia at ACC in March, almost a year ago, I think. It came about because I was reading Deleuze and Guattari, and I have this compulsion to need to talk about everything I read. But also I think to Julia's larger project, so many of us who've been through the left, especially who came in really kind of explicitly in 2017, have seen these kinds of boom and bust cycles of people going after each other, and in the name of kind of liberatory politics, and so I just kind of seen these. There just seemed to be such a discrepancy between the politics that someone was espousing and their behavior and their action. And one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari talk about microfascism as is It's, you know, they are materialists. I think maybe Orthodox Marxists would have a real issue with that, but they are they are materialists. Well, okay. So when they talk about microfascism, it isn't necessarily like the term microaggression. It's not even necessarily discrete acts. It's about what they call a milieu, which in French means middle, right? So it's about an environment. It's kind of about a culture. It's about, like not systematic necessarily, but Julia mentioned that Bradish kind of points to the emergent qualities of microfascism prior to fascism's emergence. And one of the examples Deleuze and Guattari talk about is how microfascism is a horizontal kind of process. So it's not so much like the guy on top of you telling you what to do. It's the tyranny of the bureaucrat down the hall, right? It's the kind of the shop owner who's, persecuting people of color who step into his store. It's these kinds of milieus that can kind of be activated by fascists. I think one of the examples I come back to a lot is the Serbian when the Serbians started partaking in genocide in post-Yugoslavia. It was soccer clubs, a lot of soccer fan clubs that were activated as death squads, right? And for a variety of reasons, a bunch of men drinking together who already were used to fighting, right? That's an emergent quality that can very easily step into fascism. And so to bring it back to your original question about the workshop, I think, Julia and I were very much a part of the JCC, and, we worked very hard to kind of create this left Jewish space that we wanted to see that we don't really think existed anywhere else. And we were interested in this topic, and one of the luxuries of the JCC, at least at that time, was the ability to say, hey, we want to do something. And so, we were talking amongst ourselves, and she was working on her book, and we were just let's offer this to our community. And we honestly had no idea who would show up, and it was incredibly fruitful. And it's a really interesting project to take high French post-structuralist theory and bring it down to a real life level. So.
Yeah, it was such a good experience. I was pretty nervous. I'd never done anything like that before, and it was so. Not only was it fun, but it seems like people got a lot out of it. The room was full, and after it ended, I maybe other people have had this experience too. I've heard other people talk about experiences they've had that were like this, where I felt so light, as if this is what I'm meant to be doing. I don't know. It was hard to explain, or you feel wow, this is just the best. So I hope I get a chance to do more things like that in the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for this brilliant talk. I found so much out of this, but I wanted to talk about a kind of tension I see in the avant-garde filmmakers that you've talked about today. With regard to their treatment of the everyday, and you talk about, everyday microfascisms, and you brought in Vertov, you brought in, sort of Godard in some ways, but because I wonder how much, this estrangement or defamiliarization from the everyday, in order to get us to consciously think about the ways in which our everyday lives are ideologically and politically constructed and manipulated, etc. To what extent that also throws us out of a positive engagement with the everyday, and I think you used enchantment as a word with Matsumoto, which is also what some of these films are doing, right? They're asking us to care about the everyday, and I think you used as far as Saluda Cuban as an example there. So I see this interesting kind of tension between being kind of thrown out, estranged, defamiliarized from the everyday, and being kind of re-enchanted by the everyday, and bringing that to our current moment. I'm a professor, and I see a lot of cynicism, a lot of apathy, a lot of apoliticism coming from my students, which kind of, it goes to that just not caring about the everyday, right? Being completely withdrawn from any care about what is going on in the world around us, which maybe relates to the comment on the bystanders. But where does that fit in aesthetically? So to introduce another dichotomy to this, apathy and care, apathy versus care, right? And being politically engaged versus not being politically engaged. And I think that could even relate to some of the crisis of belief that you talk about with Vertov. You use Michelson to talk about that, and you kind of reintroduce it with AI, which is interesting because I think that depends on how much we care whether an image is human generated or AI generated, right? We care right now, but are we going to care in 2 years, 3 years? Do our students care right now? I'm not sure. So yeah, that question of care, I guess, and how that relates to the aesthetics of the everyday that the avant-garde is sort of politically engaged with.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And you point to like really a fundamental tension in the book between a dichotomy between filmmakers that mobilize or reject the idea of pleasure. Because I think really it's the concept of pleasure. And I think both within this idea of like pleasure, there's the kind of Matsumoto side of things and the Agnes Varda side of things. And the Matsumoto side of things, and I think this sort of dichotomy between Matsumoto and Varda, and I'm just like throwing this out now, I don't talk about this in the book as a dichotomy, but it just occurs to me that it is now. They're both, and all the filmmakers in the project are thinking about pleasure as something that is not what like Peter Wolin would talk about pleasure, right? It's not pleasure as in I'm watching a movie and I'm just not thinking and I'm getting pleasure from just it washing over me and that kind of entertainment, like the cinema of attractions and whatnot. But instead, it's like a what Matsumoto Toshio called like the sadomasochistic pleasure. So either way, the pleasure is not a passive pleasure, but Matsumoto Toshio and Varda are very different in their conceptions of care. Like Varda is very kind of like other-oriented, and there's a real care and affective care that is exuded in her films. Matsumoto is so connected, and I think this is more. Even though he wasn't a Maoist, there is an element of like Maoist self-critique that is kind of connected here. He's constantly he's very, very critical of others and also very critical of himself. So there's an issue, I was just talking about this the other day, an issue of a journal that he edited. He was the editor-in-chief of documentary film or Kiroku Eiga. And when his film with the Weavers of Nishijin from '61 came out, he had an entire issue criticizing the film, like maybe a few raves, but everyone was kind of exegetically kind of digging into this film. Like it was a very literal, like I will destroy myself in order to build something anew. But the aspect of care doesn't really isn't really a part of his technique. But it is a very masculinist kind of way of thinking about things. And I do think, without bringing back to, women and the feminine is more care-oriented and the masculine is not, but that is the dynamic that one sees in the 60s. Except for the fact that I think, so in my book, my secret favorite chapter is everyone has one, right? A secret favorite chapter is on the kind of communist circle in France in the mid-60s around the film critic Georges Sadoul and Alain René and Chris Marker and Agnes Varda. And they, I like just reprint and translate a roundtable that they have when they talk about the pleasures of film, and they talk about film as both. It needs to be a potato and a flower, and I think there's something there with regard to the way that they interact with each other has this like caring dimension. No one knows about this stuff because it was in a communist journal that only exists now in microfilm in like 3 universities, even though it was massively popular at this time, as happens, I suppose, but with communist films, with media. But I think there you could see it's not just Agnes Varda. It's also Alain René seems to be a filmmaker of care for these communist critics and this communist kind of Communist Party officially like journal that was head by Louis Aragon. So it had this surrealist dimension to it. So it could be the surrealism that connects to care and a surrealism that's more sadomasochistic. Yeah.
I kind of thought something, about care, and I feel like for us, we're in a really threatened time. Teachers or teachers union just endorsed somebody who's a kind of a Farrakhan type follower, and a lot of really ugly stuff. And and didn't, took it back, but didn't pull down any books off the internet. So it's a scary place to be, and it's a silenced place to be. And then it made me think when you were talking about like Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses, who writes a book about, and how at the end, like there's a whole piece at the end of 1984 where, what's his name? Winston is looking out at the woman singing, and, the prole singing, and she's like sort of just so not part of the world in a way. Like she's just, she's, bloated with childbearing, but he's like, she's so beautiful, like these women exist everywhere. And it kind of, it's like, it's hard because the caring I'm seeing is so intense and so ugly. And that sometimes the people that are on the outside of the caring, that's a better resistance than the caring. Because, it is the emotion, like you're talking about, and I don't know how to respond, like you were asking, I can't put together, as a person who's given my life to compassion, how to even go about dealing with all of those things.
Yeah, although that caring about something is different from giving care. I mean, I think in the sense that you
Well, apathy,
yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
think that's an interesting distinction, right? Is caring about versus fascist care.
Yeah, they care a lot.
They care about the world.
Yeah.
And maybe similarly to the anti-fascist avant-garde that you're talking about, similarly having the unconscious, anti-rational, they both also have care. So it's slippery.
It is slippery. It's very slippery. And it also, I think it is important to point out, like, I like thinking in a utopian way, and I love, showing people these movies and being very excited about them. But in the end, it is the world now wonderful, all, communist, perfect utopia? No, obviously they're failures, So, and especially in Japan after 1973, there was really like a firm cutoff, and there was really very little activism that happened after. It's like 73 was really like a turning point, and they I think I use the term shirake, or like apathy, that it's that term like spread among the youth, and so much so that this was actually true from the early 60s. You could get a card that said that you were non-political. Like people would get cards that said, I am non-puri. Like, and Nick Kapoor, who teaches at Rutgers Camden, has been doing a lot of work on this. So the people wanted to show themselves as not caring so much that they cared about these cards that specifically said, I don't care, So it's very, very, very strange, and I hope we don't, end up in that kind of moment where, the post-73 moment, but maybe that is the direction that we're heading, and that would be really sad if it were true. I have noticed that, just to return to your comment, I've noticed that with my students as well, but I also noticed a kind of increased kind of annoyance at films that question one's view of reality. So like I've noticed that I don't only teach these kind of films, but every year I think it becomes more and more difficult to teach them. And I think that's interesting. Every year the least popular film in my giant film 101 type class is Daisies, which is the most fun film. And I keep asking them, I never get upset with my students, but I do in that class. I'm like, what? And just this film is so fun. It's so fun, but I don't think they receive.
Super surrealist.
Yeah.
They
literally it's about these two girls, and the film cuts itself up. Like there's a collage sequence where the film is literally cut into little pieces and jumbles around, and they eat sausages and as this is happening, and it's just very, very fun and bizarre. But the tolerance of the bizarre, I think, is becoming kind of basically I think students are becoming decreasingly tolerant of the bizarre, and I don't know if there's anything that one can do, but one can try by just confronting them and barraging them with this imagery, and I don't know, but yeah.
Well, maybe we'll pause there on the image of the bizarre, and everyone must go watch Daisies. But
yes,
before that, we will thank you, Alekseyeva, one more time.